The day Tatiana Schlossberg gave birth to her second child, doctors noticed something they weren't expecting. It wasn't pain, it wasn't complications, it was a number on a chart that didn't make sense, and within hours, her life split into a before and an after. She carried one of the most famous last names in America, yet this moment had nothing to do with history or politics. What followed was a fight she never planned for, one she chose to document in real time, even as the clock started working against her. And almost no one saw it coming. Tatiana Schlossberg was born into one of the most recognizable families in American history, but she never tried to live off the name. While the Kennedy legacy is often tied to politics, power, and constant public attention, she took a very different route. She stayed out of campaigns, avoided the spotlight, and showed little interest in becoming another public figure tied to Washington or family mythology. Instead, she built a life around reporting and research. Tatiana became a journalist focused on climate change and the environment, spending years writing about issues most people overlook but live with every day. Her work wasn't flashy or political theater. It was quiet, detailed, and rooted in facts. She wanted readers to understand how their everyday choices affected the planet, not who her relatives were. Even as a Kennedy, she managed something rare: privacy. She worked, raised her family, and wrote without chasing attention or controversy. For a long time, her name barely crossed outside journalism circles. But that low-profile life wouldn't last, because something happened that forced her story into public view. Suddenly, and without warning, the moment that changed everything was supposed to be one of the happiest days of her life. Tatiana Schlossberg had just given birth to her second child, a new baby, a growing family, and plans stretching far into the future. Nothing about that day suggested danger. But while she was still in the hospital, doctors noticed something that didn't sit right. It wasn't a dramatic collapse or a sudden emergency, just numbers that looked off during routine checks. At first, it didn't feel urgent. Then, more tests were ordered. And suddenly, the celebration was replaced with confusion and fear. The results pointed to a rare and aggressive blood cancer, one that usually shows up much later in life. Tatiana was only 34. The timing made it even harder to process, holding a newborn while being told her own body was turning against her. What should have been the beginning of a new chapter became the start of something else entirely. And as shocking as the diagnosis was, it turned out to be only the first step in a long, exhausting fight she never saw coming. At first, Tatiana Schlossberg fought in private. Between hospital rooms and long stretches of waiting, she focused on getting through each day, protecting her family from the full weight of what was happening. But, as the months passed, she made a choice that few people in her position would make. She decided to write about it. In an essay published in The New Yorker, Tatiana laid everything out with striking honesty. There was no dramatic language, no plea for sympathy, just clear, steady reflections on what it felt like to live inside a body that no longer followed the rules. She wrote about uncertainty, about hope that kept shifting, and about the strange disconnect of being critically ill while the rest of the world kept moving. What stood out most was her tone. Calm, thoughtful, human. She wasn't trying to inspire or shock anyone. She was trying to understand her own reality, while juggling treatment schedules, newborn nights, and the quiet fear that never fully left. But her writing didn't stay focused on her illness alone. As she shared her experience, she began pulling back the curtain on something else. Decisions being made far beyond her hospital room that could affect people like her, everywhere. As she wrote more openly, Tatiana Schlossberg touched on a subject that made people pause, because this time it involved her own family. In her essay, she shared deep concerns about the direction of health policy being pushed by her cousin, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. She didn't frame it as a family feud or a public attack. She framed it as something deeply personal. From her hospital bed, medical research wasn't an abstract talking point. It was real. It was the doctors around her, the treatments being tested, and the trials that offered a chance, however small, for more time. Policies around vaccines and research funding weren't political debates to her. They were lifelines, and she worried that changes being discussed could leave people like her more vulnerable, not safer. What made the moment striking was how rare it was. Members of the Kennedy family are known for calculated public statements, careful distance, and silence when things get complicated. Tatiana broke from that pattern. She spoke as a patient, a mother, and a journalist, not as a political figure, and she did it knowing it might make people uncomfortable. But even as she spoke out, time wasn't slowing down. The treatments continued, the options narrowed, and the clock kept moving forward, whether anyone was ready for it or not. As the fight went on, Tatiana Schlossberg began writing about a fear she couldn't reason away. It wasn't just about her health anymore. It was about time, and how little of it she might have left. She wrote about her children in a way that felt almost unbearable to read, about wondering whether they would remember her voice, her face, or the small, ordinary moments that make up a parent's presence. The idea that her son and daughter might grow up with only fragments of her stayed with her, even on the days she tried to stay hopeful. There was also the quiet grief of an unfinished life. Plans she and her husband had made. Years she assumed were guaranteed. A future that suddenly felt borrowed instead of promised. She didn't dramatize it or ask for pity. She simply acknowledged the loss as it came, piece by piece. And even in her own fear, she worried more about the people around her. She could sense the pain her parents and siblings tried to hide, the way they carried it silently so she wouldn't feel responsible for their suffering. That awareness weighed on her just as heavily as the illness itself. When she eventually passed, it didn't just mark the end of her fight. It reopened a wound the Kennedy family knows all too well, another loss, another name added to a history shaped by grief. Tatiana Schlossberg's death echoed through a family already no stranger to tragedy. Her grandfather, President John F. Kennedy, was assassinated when her mother was just a child. Her great-uncle, Robert F. Kennedy, was lost to violence as well. Her uncle, John F. Kennedy, Jr., along with his wife and sister-in-law, died in a plane crash. Loss has long been a shadow over the family, and Tatiana's passing added another quiet, devastating note. Her fight made her passing feel especially cruel. She had confronted every day with courage, writing openly, balancing treatment with motherhood, and facing the reality of her illness with extraordinary honesty. She didn't give up easily. She didn't fade quietly. She fought with everything she had, and yet the disease won in the end. Family members spoke about her with a mixture of sorrow and admiration. Maria Shriver called her the light, the humor, the joy, and praised her as a journalist who used her words to teach others about the world and the environment. Her mother, Caroline, her siblings Rose and Jack, and her husband George shared grief that was both private and profound, emphasizing the person Tatiana was: intelligent, kind, thoughtful, and brave. Even in this grief, it was clear that Tatiana's story didn't end with her death. Tatiana Schlossberg left behind more than a name or a story of struggle. She left a legacy of work and insight that will continue to resonate. As a journalist, she focused on climate change and environmental issues, reporting for outlets like the New York Times, The Atlantic, and The Washington Post. Her writing wasn't about headlines or fame. It was about helping people understand the world they live in and the impact of the choices they make. Her 2019 book, Inconspicuous Consumption: The Environmental Impact You Don't Know You Have, earned the Rachel Carson Environment Book Award, reflecting her ability to turn complex topics into clear, meaningful lessons. Through her work, she educated thousands, sometimes quietly, often subtly, but always with a focus on truth over spectacle. Even in her final months, her writing remained a testament to empathy and courage. She didn't shy away from her own vulnerability, but neither did she use it to seek attention. Every word, every essay, was meant to inform, inspire, and shed light, whether on the environment, on illness, or on life itself. Her story reminds us that legacy isn't only measured by fame or family ties, it's measured by the honesty of our voice, the care we show others, and the courage to face even the hardest truths. And for Tatiana Schlossberg, that legacy is far from over. Tatiana Schlossberg's life reminds us that even a famous last name can't shield anyone from the fragility of existence. Behind the history, the headlines, and the public fascination, she was first and always a person, a mother, a daughter, a sister, a journalist, and a voice for the planet. Her story wasn't about celebrity. It was about humanity, the courage to face the unexpected, the honesty to speak one's truth, and the care to leave the world a little better than she found it. In the end, what lingers isn't the tragedy of her passing, but the quiet strength of how she lived. Her legacy isn't measured in notoriety or power, but in the lives she touched, the knowledge she shared, and the example she set for facing life with clarity, empathy, and courage. And as we remember her, we're reminded that every story matters, not because of the name attached to it, but because of the voice telling it.